In other words, nearly 1 in every 4 workers is functionally unemployed in America today. Hardly something to celebrate.
The veteran who owns the car told us she has no idea who Mike is.
Mike. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. But your name.
All right. Voters were right about the economy. The data was wrong. Before the presidential election, many Democrats were puzzled by the seeming disconnect between economic reality as reflected in various government statistics and the public's perceptions of the economy on the ground. Many in Washington bristled at the public's failure to register how strong the economy really was. They charged that right-wing echo chambers were conning voters into believing entirely preposterous narratives about America's decline. Preposterous. But they rarely considered whether something might be responsible for the disconnect, whether, for instance, government statistics were fundamentally flawed. What if the numbers supporting the case for broad-based prosperity were themselves misrepresentations? What if, in fact, darker assessments of the economy were more authentically tethered to reality? For the longest time, unemployment rate was a great way to measure the economy. Because when you got a job, it paid a good wage. Because we had strong unionization, we had inflation wages were growing faster than inflation. So having a job meant you were probably okay. Even if you had a shitty job, it would pay you enough to have a, studio apartment. You'd be able to fill the fridge. You'd be able to afford to take a bus, maybe go to a movie once in a while, hang out with your friends at the local dive bar. You may not have had an amazing life full of like luxuries, but you were able to make ends meet, even with a shitty job, right? That is no longer the case. Over half of homeless people have a job. Like it's not the same. On some level, I relate to the underlying frustrations. Having served as comptroller of the currency during the 90s, I spent substantial chunks of my career exploring the gaps between public perception and economic reality, particularly in the realm of finance. Many of the officials I've befriended and advised over the last quarter century, members of the Federal Reserve, those running regulatory agencies, many leaders in Congress, have told me they consider it their responsibility to set public opinion aside and deal with the economy as it exists by the hard numbers. For them, government statistics are thought to be as reliable as solid facts. This sounds like, honestly, when I listen to this sounds like Soviet dogmatism. Is that how it actually used to be? Yes. Yes. When your parents were growing up, a married couple that both had a full-time job could easily afford a home in a desirable city. I mean, you could still see it today. You could go into neighborhoods in Los Angeles right now where homes go for $3 million, knock on the door of a house that's been around for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and you'll find a teacher and a bus driver in there. But when you go and see the new home, if you go to a house that was just purchased, it's somebody with some high-flying fucking job. Millennials, like what it takes to be in the same neighborhood as your parents is almost incomprehensible. In recent years, however, as my focus has broadened beyond finance to the economy as a whole, the disconnect between hard government numbers and popular perception has spurred me to question that faith. I've had the benefit of living in two realms that seem to rarely intersect, one as a Washington insider, the other as advisor to lenders and investors across the country. Toggling between the two has led me to be increasingly skeptical that the government's measurements properly capture the realities defining unemployment, wage growth, and the strength of the economy as a whole. These numbers have time and time again suggested to many in Washington that unemployment is low, that wages are growing for middle America, and that to a lesser or greater degree, economic growth is lifting all boats year upon year. But when traveling the country, I've encountered something very different. Cities that appeared increasingly seedy, regions that seemed derelict. Driving into the office each day in Washington, I noticed a homeless encampment fixed outside the Federal Reserve itself. And then I began to detect a second pattern inside and outside DC. This is objectively true. And it's true everywhere. America is a shit fucking hole. You know what has made me even more confident in this? I've lived in Austria a lot. Vio and I have kind of like taken like, I've like gone to Austria for like months at a time, as a tourist. And the experience of being in Austria and then comparing that to being the experience of being in Philadelphia or Los Angeles or Vegas or anywhere. It's night and day. America is a shit fucking hole. A shithole. I mean, I walked all around Vienna. I went to the like poorest parts of the city, which is there isn't really. I would go to the most, crime-ridden shit areas. I've never once, not once, did I feel like I was under physical threat and I had to have my fucking my radar dish up. Now, if you're in America and you're walking around the streets, you have to have your head on a fucking swivel. That's just reality. I will get approached by panhandlers constantly. There is a kind of simmering tension that exists that does not exist in Austria. I've encountered something very different. Cities that appeared increasingly seedy, regions that have seemed derelict. Driving into the office each day in Washington, I noticed a homeless encampment fixed upon outside the Federal Reserve itself, and then I began to detect a second pattern inside and outside D.C. alike. Democrats on the whole seem much more inclined to believe that what the economic indicators reported. Republicans, by contrast, seemed more inclined to believe what they were seeing with their own two eyes. Within the nation's capital, this gap in perception has had profound implications. For decades, a small cohort of federal agencies have reported many of the same economic statistics using fundamentally the same methodology or relying on the same sources at the same appointed times. Rarely has anyone ever asked whether the figures they released hew to reality. Given my newfound skepticism, I decided several years ago to gather a team of researchers under the rubric of the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity to delve deeply into some of the most frequently cited headline statistics. What we uncovered shocked us. The bottom line is that for 20 years or more, including the months prior to the election, voter perception was more reflective of reality than the incumbent statistics. Our research revealed that the data collected by various agencies is largely accurate. Moreover, the people staffing those agencies are talented and well-intentioned, but the filters used to compute the headline statistics are flawed. As a result, they paint a much rosier picture of reality than bears out on the ground. Take as a particularly egregious example what is probably the most widely reported economic indicator, unemployment. Known to experts as the U3, the number misleads in several ways. First, it counts as unemployed the millions of people who are unwillingly underemployed. That is, people who, for example, work only a few hours each week while searching for a full-time job. Second, it does not take into account many Americans who have been so discouraged that they're no longer trying to get a job. This is the thing that I think is really crazy, and I think why most people are insane. Like, for example, if you work as an Uber driver 5 to 10 hours a week, according to the unemployment statistics, you are employed. But you probably don't feel employed. You're probably like, I don't have a real job. I'm just doing this to try to like make rent or afford groceries. But there didn't used to have jobs like that. 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have Uber driving. It wasn't a thing. So you would have just been considered unemployed. We have this magic gig. We have this gig economy Band-Aid that's just completely obscuring reality. Shit is way worse than it has ever been, except for during the Great Recession in my lifetime. Like, this is dog shit. The economy sucks ass. You can, and by the way, the prices are insane. I don't know how people are surviving. I don't know. I don't get it. Finally, the prevailing statistics does not account for the meagerness of any individual's income. Thus, you could be homeless on the streets, making an intermittent income, and functionally incapable of keeping your family fed, and the government would count you as employed. I don't believe those who went into this past election taking pride in the unemployment numbers understood that the near record low unemployment figures, the figure was a mere 4.2% in November, counted homeless people doing occasional work as employed. But the implications are powerful. If you filter the statistics to include as unemployed people who can't find anything but part-time work or who make a poverty wage, the percentage is actually 23.7%. In other words, nearly 1 in every 4 workers is functionally unemployed in America today. Hardly something to celebrate. No. Listen, if you have a gig job where you deliver groceries for $8 an hour, You're doing great. You're employed. What are you complaining about? The economy's great. The picture is similarly misleading when examining the methodology used to track how much Americans are earning. The prevailing government indicator, known colloquially as weekly earnings, tracks full-time wages to the exclusion of both the unemployed and those engaged in typically lower-paid part-time work. Today, as a result, those keeping track are led to believe that the median wage in the U.S. stands at roughly $61,900. But if you track everyone in the workforce, that is, you include part-time workers and unemployed job seekers, the results are remarkably different. Our research reveals that the median wage is actually little more than $52,300 per year. Think of that. American workers in the median are making 16% less than the prevailing statistics would indicate. Perhaps the most prominent issue of the 2024 campaign, inflation, tracks much of the same story. Democrats spent much of the campaign pointing out that inflation had abated by Election Day, even if prices remained elevated from pre-pandemic levels. Moreover, many noted that wages, according to the prevailing statistic that only full-time work into account, had risen at a faster clip. These claims were based on observations drawn largely from the Consumer Price Index, an indicator that tracks the prices charged for 80,000 goods and services across the economy. But the CPI also perceives reality through a very rosy-looking glass. Those with modest incomes purchase only a fraction of the 80,000 goods the CPI tracks, spending a much greater share of their earnings on basics like groceries, healthcare, and rent. And that, of course, affects the overall figure. If prices for eggs, insurance premiums, and studio apartment leases rise at a faster clip than those of luxury goods and second homes, the CPI underestimates the impact of inflation on the bulk of Americans. That, of course, is exactly what has happened. My colleagues and I have modeled an alternative indicator, one that excludes many of the items that only the well-off tend to purchase and tend to have more stable prices over time, and focuses on the measurement of prices charged for basic necessities, the goods and services that lower and middle income families typically can't avoid. Here again, the results reveal how challenges facing those with more modest incomes are obscured by the numbers. Our alternative indicator reveals that since 2001, the cost of living for Americans with modest incomes has risen 35% faster than the CPI. Put another way, the resources required to simply maintain the same working class lifestyle over the last 2 decades has risen much more dramatically than we've been led to believe. No shit! No fucking shit! And here's the reality here. Those of us who are not rich know this. Now, what's crazy about me is that I am in touch while at the same time being successful doing my stream. And I have a lot of friends that are people that are trying to make their own way in the world and are poor. And I know exactly the struggles that they're going through because that was me 10 years ago. And so I pay attention to that shit. I'm not in some fucking bubble of upper middle class largesse like most of the people who shop at Rodeo Drive, or those are just upper class people, but you get my point. Like, the idea that the economy was good is an insane belief that I couldn't believe so many people online were saying. And then I realized the type of people that are talking about politics have a lot of free time. The effect, of course, was particularly intense in the wake of the pandemic. In 2023 alone, the CPI indicated that inflation had driven up prices by 4.1%. But the true cost of living, as measured by our research, rose more than twice as much, a full 9.4%. And then the other thing to keep in mind is this doesn't talk about, and this is the other thing, this doesn't talk about the increase of financing costs, right? So the prices have gone up much faster at 9.4%, but also interest rates have gone up. Interest rates have gone up, which means that if my car has gone up 9%, right? But the cost of the interest on my car loan has tripled. Now my car payment that would have been $300 is now $700. And I'm getting the same fucking car. And that laid bare the oft-quoted repost that wage gains outpaced inflation during the crisis following COVID-19. When our more targeted measure of inflation is set atop a more accurate measure of weekly earnings, it immediately becomes clear that purchasing power fell at the median by 4.3% in 2023. Again, whatever anyone may have claimed for the prevailing statistics during the run-up to the 2024 election, reality was drastically more dire for the great majority of Americans. Which brings us to the question of gross domestic product, a figure that stands perhaps as the most important single economic indicator because it is commonly viewed as a proxy for prosperity writ large. There is, to be sure, real value in tracking the sheer volume of domestic production, though GDP is an imperfect measure even of that. But as useful as that figure may be in the sense that it purports to track generalized national wealth, it is hampered by a profound flaw. It reveals almost nothing about how the attendant prosperity is shared. That is, if a small slice of the population is awarded the great bulk of the bounty from economic growth, while everyone else remains unenriched, GDP would rise nevertheless. And that, to a critical degree, is exactly what has happened. Here, the aggregate measure of GDP has hidden the reality that a more modest societal split has grown into an economic chasm. Since 2013, Americans with bachelor's or more advanced degrees have, in the aggregate, seen their material well-being improve. But the Federal Reserve's estimate, an additional tenth of adults have risen to comfort. Those without high school degrees, by contrast, have seen no real improvement. And geographic disparities have widened along similar lines, with places ranging from San Francisco to Boston seeing big jumps in income and prosperity, but places ranging from Youngstown, Ohio to Port Arthur, Texas falling further behind. The crucial point, even before digging into the nuances, is clear. America's GDP has grown, and yet we remain largely blind to these disparities. Taking all of these statistical discrepancies together, what we have here is a collection of economic indicators that all point in the same misleading direction. They shroud the reality faced by middle and lower income households. The problem isn't that some Americans didn't come out ahead after 4 years of Bidenomics. Some did. It's that, for the most part, those living in more modest circumstances have endured the last 20 years of setbacks, and the last 4 years did not turn things around enough for the lower 60% of American income earners. To be fair, the prevailing indicators aren't without merit. For example, it is useful to know the wages of full-time employees have evolved. The challenge, quite separate from any quibbling with the talented people working to tell the nation's economic story, is to provide policymakers with a full picture of the reality faced by the bulk of the population. What we need is to find new ways to provide a more realistic picture of the nation's underlying economic conditions on a monthly basis. The indicators my colleagues and I have constructed could serve as a basis for or inspiration for government-sponsored alternatives. Regardless, something needs to change. This should not be a partisan issue. Policymakers in both parties would benefit from gleaning a more accurate sense of what's happening at the ground level of the American economy. In reality, both Democrats and Republicans were vulnerable to being snowed in the 2024 cycle. It just happened that the dissatisfaction during this particular cycle undermined the incumbent party. In an age where faith in institutions of all sorts is in free fall, Americans are perpetually told, for a classic quote from former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that while we may be entitled to our own opinions, we aren't entitled to our own facts. That should be right, at least in the realm of economics. But the reality is that if the prevailing indicators remain misleading, the facts don't apply. We have it in our grasp to cut through the mirage that led Democrats astray in 2024. The question now is whether we will correct course. And the answer is they won't. The answer is they won't, because the Democratic Party is the party of the upscale, college-educated suburbanite, the people for whom the economy has served quite well. But for everyone else, fuck you. And that's why the Democrats hate their voters. Which brings us to the next story. The next unbelievable story. Scoop. Dems pissed at liberal groups move on indivisible. Okay, so if you're thinking about politics, chat, the most left-wing groups that are playing in the electoral game, you know, you have your like DSA, then you have Working Families Party, then you have Move On, then you have Indivisible, going from left to right, right? And Indivisible, and then there's more. There's more groups that you can sprinkle in there. But that's largely the way to look at that, right? So Move On and Indivisible, those are your more like center left groups, right? They're kind of like, you know, Warrenite. Maybe even like Harris groups, right? Like Harris 2020, not Harris 2024, right? They're liberal partisans, Democrats. A closed-door meeting for House Democrats this week include a gripe fest directed at liberal grassroots organizations, sources tell Axios. Members of the Steering and Policy Committee with House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries in the room on Monday complained activist groups like Move On and Indivisible have facilitated thousands of phone calls to members' offices. People are pissed, a senior House Democrat who was at the meeting said of the lawmakers' reaction to the calls. The Democrat said Jeffries himself is very frustrated at the groups who are trying to stir up a more confrontational opposition to Trump. A Jeffries spokesperson disputed that characterization and noted to Axios that the office regularly engages with dozens of stakeholder groups, including Move On and Indivisible, including as recently as Monday. Zoom in. There were a lot of people who were like, we've got to stop the groups from doing this. People are concerned that they're saying we're not doing enough, but we're not in the majority, said one member. Some Democrats see callers as barking up the wrong tree, given their limited power as a minority power in Congress. It's been constant theme of us saying, please call the Republicans, said Rep. Don Beyer. I reject and resent the implication that congressional Democrats are simply standing by passively, said AIPAC buyout Rep. Richie Torres. People are angry, scared, and they want to see more from their lawmakers right now than floor speeches about Elon Musk, Indivisible co-founder Leah Greenberg told Axios. Indivisible is urging people who are scared to call their member of Congress, whether they have a Democrat or Republican, and make specific procedural asks. Our supporters are asking Democrats to demand specific red lines that are met before they offer their vote to House Republicans on the budget, when Republicans inevitably fail to pass a bill on their own. Move On officials declined to comment. So in other words, we have, ladies and gentlemen, a Democratic Party. You remember when people said, well, if you vote for Kamala, we'll just push her to the left. I'd rather have Kamala as my enemy and Hakeem Jeffries than Donald Trump. We'll push them to the left. We'll push them to the left. You remember that stupid fucking bullshit? It totally failed in the Biden administration with the trifecta. So when the Democrats control the government, we can't do anything, right? And when the Democrats are outside of the government, they can't fight. So they can't do anything in power, and they can't resist when they are a minority party. This party is fucking worthless. We have to get rid of it, man. We have to get rid of it. Why are there no leaders talking about getting rid of this fucking party? It is useless. We can look down in Mexico and see what they did. They started their own left-wing party, and they have a 77% approval rating. David Sirota said, there is a strong argument that if every single Dem Party lifer in D.C., every politician, staffer, advocate, think tanker, media influencer, pundit, etc., just resigned, it would be better for the party renewal and the world, and would certainly not be worse than it is right now. An entire generation of the Democrats' professional political class has made a great living in the Capitol, absolutely failing to prevent, and in many cases actually facilitating what we are living through. It is time to just say that out loud and admit it. And I said, this is basically admitting that the entire institution of the Democratic Party is damaging and worthless. If that's the case, why aren't we starting a new party like AMLO did in Mexico? And that's the question you have to ask yourself. Why the fuck are we sticking with the Democrats? Why? Why? Give me a good fucking reason. Give me one. Because money. You don't think we can raise money? Okay, we'll lose out on the billionaires, which then make you adopt unpopular policies. They make you adopt unpopular policies and you lose the fucking election anyway. You lose the election anyway. Kamala Harris had way more money than Donald Trump did, and she lost the election anyway. What good is the money if you do just fucking lose? Who will pay all the fail kids of rich people to be consultants? Yeah, to your point about standard of living, we're creating a tenants unit here in my city and want to know that everyone has come to accept, and everyone doesn't even think to raise it an issue. They're pretty much paying 50% of our income towards housing, all of us, and we have to become so disenfranchised that we don't even think about that being something we can mention or change. Yeah. The squad is a joke. And you're right. The squad is a joke. The squad has failed to meet the moment. There's no doubt about that.
The veteran who owns the car told us she has no idea who Mike is.
Mike. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. But your name